Flow Unleashed.
Beyond the dreamer ideals and broken promises, how do we actually advance humanity, practically? Welcome to Flow Unleashed. I'm Dr. Cameron Norsworthy, scientist and high-performance coach to multiple world champions. In this show, we unpack key insights on specific topics so that you are kept up to date with the latest science and practice of human performance. How to make the world a better place is a constant thorn in many people's mind. Often, the world we see around us doesn't live up to our ideals and what we know humans are capable of. Whether it's being disappointed with the political party's unrealized promises, seeing our boss at work disempower someone by perhaps shaming their lack of effort, or seeing someone in the street drop litter and not pick it up, we all share the dissatisfaction that comes with living with an imperfect world. But how do we change it? Where do we place our attention and effort to help make this world a better place? Does the world need more love, compassion, good deeds, generosity, connection, or more people who care about the world we're actively creating in our habitual sleep? All of it, surely. Though to put this into practice, we need to step into our optimal self, lead in the best way possible, and act in the manner befitting to our dreams of who we can become. Whilst there is no overnight silver bullet solution, the way we can make this a reality is to continuously level up and ensure we are getting the best training and education possible. Learning that meets our day-to-day needs and not only addresses the too often school curriculums of advancing linear intelligence aimed at progressing the corporate capitalism, but also the wisdom we need to make the world a better place. An article in the Harvard Business Review titled "The Future of Leadership Development" outlines that training courses to be better people, better leaders, have seen an enormous rise. Yet traditional educators aren't adept at teaching the soft skills vital for success today, as learners often can't apply classroom lessons to their real-world jobs, an issue also known as the skills transfer gap. In other words, what is learned is rarely applied. Companies of all sorts realize that to survive in today's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments, they need leadership skills and organizational capabilities different from those that helped them succeed in the past. Businesses will look and operate fundamentally different in 10 years from now, which means we need a new type of leader at the helm and new types of workers responding to the day-to-day demands than we do at this present moment. Therefore, the education that was appropriate 40 years ago, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago, is not necessarily appropriate for tomorrow or even today. One individual who has given this space a lot of thought and attention is our guest, David Roberts. David is passionate about transforming lives through disruptive innovation and education. He's a serial entrepreneur, award-winning CEO, and regarded as one of the world's top experts on disruptive innovation in government and technology and entrepreneurship. David has been featured on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, Fortune magazine, New York Times, CNN, and many other popular media with his concepts and lessons also being taught in many universities today.
Flow Unleashed.
Thanks, David, for having the time to have a chat with us today. I hear you're in Greece. How's Greece treating you at the moment?
Well, it's awesome, and thank you for having me, Cameron, today. Greece has been fabulous. I'm here on business and pleasure, but here really to speak with a number of both government and business leaders about a different plan for Greece's future. I think Greece has really been challenged economically in an extraordinary way relative to the other countries in Europe. And my understanding is that the current plan they have is really about getting jobs. And I don't believe that jobs are actually the best path to prosperity for a country in, this next century. I think entrepreneurship is. And so I'm working with some fabulous people here around the idea of creating a kind of an entrepreneurial epicenter here, very similar to the one that's in Sweden, to just draw some of the best entrepreneurs to Greece, draw many of the Greek entrepreneurs back to Greece, and create a very different kind of an economy.
What's your challenge, your biggest challenge there, and how are you overcoming it?
Yeah, my belief is sort of the key is how do you attract entrepreneurs? And entrepreneurs, because of globalization, they get to choose where they go in the world. And obviously Silicon Valley has an environment that draws many of them. But, other countries have been successful in programs they created. For example, Chile created something, I think it was over 10 years ago, called Chile Startup, where they basically, if you came to Chile as an entrepreneur, you could get $50,000 from the government. And initially it was, I think you had to hire one Chilean, but I think they even got rid of that. And it was one of the few places where entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley would leave Silicon Valley and go to another country. They go to Chile to do their startups. And as a result of that, the culture that those entrepreneurs have got kind of integrated and injected into Chilean culture, and it's really made an extraordinary impact. So that's one of the things. But I think, one of the keys is having a place where entrepreneurs are close to each other, and that you get this supportive, experimental, positive culture around the creation of really scalable companies. That's, I think, the real key.
Having that kind of bounce factor. And I know Silicon Valley is famous for that saying, fail fast. But when there's a lot of people with a similar aim to take measured risks and have social innovation that does positive things, it's an inspiring ecosystem. Is that something that, I know you've been the vice president of Singularity University, and is that a culture that you find is easy to introduce to new systems?
Well, ecosystems are the key. So I appreciate you using that word, because that really is the key term of what you're trying to create. They can be extraordinarily difficult, but my belief is that everything is difficult until it's easy. And so once you know how something works or how to do it, then you can just get it right. And I believe that entrepreneurial ecosystems are the same. So many countries have or are trying to create those ecosystems, and many of them don't know how to do it because it's the first time that they've ever done it. And no one yet has written a really good book on how those ecosystems get created. But there are really fabulous examples of places where those ecosystems got built. South Korea is one that did it in a very democratic environment. But what I like about Sweden, and there's a wonderful guy by the name of Ola Alvarsson. In fact, I just spent a week with him here in Mykonos, Greece, who built that epicenter in Sweden. And Sweden has just, if you looked at what countries in Europe create the most unicorns, I think Sweden is either number 2 or number 3. But even if it's number 3, clearly, if you looked at economically what's going on in those different countries, it's astounding. It's astounding how many new unicorns get created in Sweden. So hard until they're easy.
Yeah. And I guess there's also a challenge of keeping it. I mean, I guess Google is a good example in the sense of starting off very young and now it's a beast. What's your take on keeping that inspirational kind of ecosystem going without falling into the traps of over centralization, etc.?
I knew the Google founders just because they got funded at the same time that a company I had got funded, and it was by the same people. And I remember in those very early days, it was so fascinating to me. What I realized is that entrepreneurs rarely succeed at the thing they want to succeed at, but they usually succeed at something else. And even they were very interested in creating a search engine to sell to Yahoo, which they failed at. And then, they had to come up with another plan, and it was really extraordinary. But yeah, I think that there's a challenge, right, in scaling, and how do you maintain innovation as companies grow? And I think that too has really been figured out. A guy by the name of Clay Christensen, who is the man who actually came up with the phrase disruptive innovation. He was a Harvard Business School professor, and he came up with the theory of disruption. One guy is responsible for that. But he kind of cracked this idea, and what he basically said is that if you have a large monolithic company, they have a profit model, and the profit model sort of forces them to chase high margin activities. And as a result of that, they keep reinvesting in high margin activities, and then they never are able to actually invest in low margin activities, which are these disruptive things. And so he absolutely believed that big companies cannot disrupt themselves. And that if they wanted to disrupt themselves, and I agree with him, that the only way to do it is to create an independent business unit that has a different profit model. And then because of that, has a different resource allocation process. And so the resources actually go to the right things, and they can seize these opportunities, these emergent opportunities. It's an incredible theory. He didn't write as much about that, but I think it does solve this issue that you just brought up about how do you prevent that giant monolithic company.
And, I guess that's integral with the leadership of that system and who is there. And how would you, just to divert a little bit, how would you classify leadership? Leadership. It's been called many things in the past, and my sort of simplified version, I guess, is to inspire, and whether that's inspire action or whatever. But so often in the past, I feel it's been tainted by maintaining compliance with perfection. How would you view leadership and the importance of that in creating those ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, I think better leadership definitely has aspects of inspiration. I separate management from leadership. Those two things to me are very different. Management is making sure that things are efficient and productive and that operations run well. Leadership is more about change. But to me, leadership is about influencing people. And so, you can have leadership for bad purposes, and you can have leaders that are inherently evil, but they're really good still at leadership. I mean, Hitler I would characterize him as an evil leader, but he was still really good at leading, just not in a way that much of the world ultimately appreciated or obviously had no desire to appreciate. So I think there's different kinds of leadership, though. And I also think that there's even different levels of leadership. At the lowest level, we have self-leadership. I mean, I think our own brain actually has many different minds in it. And those little minds kind of compete with each other, and even their voices compete with each other. And if you can have strong leadership with yourself, you can have sort of the right voice leading the others and saying yes and no. And I think that's one of the most powerful transformations that people make in their life. It's just being able to hear those voices, because sometimes we don't even hear them. We just do. And we don't realize why we do things or how we go about making decisions with ourselves. I think the best leadership on the other end of the spectrum is a term I call exponential leadership. And it means something very specific to me. It has nothing to do with technology, but exponential leadership is the idea that really great leaders can not only create other really great leaders. In fact, it's one of the differences. I think good leaders create followers, but really great leaders create other leaders. And the greatest leaders create other leaders that know how to create other leaders that know how to create other leaders recursively. And those leaders change the world. And if you looked at any of the greatest leaders in the world, from Gandhi to Nelson Mandela to Martin Luther King, even Mother Teresa, you would find that is the skill that they had. And it's an extraordinary skill.
I love that idea. And I feel self-leadership is a key component of that. I mean, when we look at bringing up children or, kids, and they do what we do, not what we say. And self-leadership's obviously, or commonly, left till last. We want to learn how to lead other people or learn how to manage or increase our professional skills, and all the time putting our self-leadership at the sort of back of the line in terms of priority. But how we do things and how we manage those thoughts and voices in our head. And I always like to think of the voices in our head as a boardroom, and, which directors are leading our thought processes, and who's the chairman every year. To another chairman, they can have such significant impact on our moment to moment thinking and therefore our actions and so forth.
Yeah.
What do you think are the key components to self-leadership?
I think the key component is almost more of the key skills. And the skills to me are these very critical character traits that we are rarely born with. We kind of master them through experiences. But, as we master these character traits, then leadership, whether it's influencing or creating other leaders. In fact, I think like the greatest leaders in the world, what they do is they just help people to live better lives. And I think, that's our real ultimate goal, is how do we live great lives? Because that's ultimately the only real thing that we have, because nothing obviously stays with us when we die. So these character traits, I think knowing which ones really matter a lot, and then understanding how to develop them. Because it's not, for example, let's say courage, and I believe courage is one of the important ones. Just like compassion or curiosity. You can't really read a book and become courageous. In fact, I think you can't even listen really to someone else and easily become courageous. In other words, I can't give a bunch of lectures and then create a bunch of courageous people. And so it's more than knowledge, and it's more than just experiences and things. And so mastering character traits is in itself both an art and a science. But if you can acquire these critical character traits, your entire life is transformed. Take curiosity, for example. Curiosity equals intelligence. I mean, if you're not curious, you can never become intelligent. And I sort of vividly remember this when I went through MIT, and it's a really fabulous school. But when I graduated, I had lost my curiosity for engineering, which is what I was studying, because I just sort of had too much of it in too large of a quantity and too high a pace. And then afterward, I didn't want to do it. And I didn't do it for many years. But that's the most critical thing. I mean, if you could graduate dumb engineers that were incredibly curious about engineering, you will have succeeded.
It's one of Einstein's famous quotes, isn't it? I'm not intelligent. I just was more curious than others. I stayed with the problem longer, looked at the detail longer than others. Curiosity really helps to open ideas and doors more than limit them. And what do you feel is a way to foster that curiosity within us?
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I want to give MIT credit, because one of the things they did do is they made things so hard for those 4 years. So, for example, if I remember in my freshman year, I took a test. It was a physics test, and I scored like a 32 out of 100 on it. And I just thought I had just failed miserably. And then I found out I got an A. So I felt really stupid when I took the test. But everyone, I guess, was feeling really stupid. And because they have that method, when you graduate, you're used to sort of things being really hard, and you don't care. You're used to that. You just expect things to be really hard. And so I think a lot of MIT graduates go after really hard problems because they were really trained to just be used to hard problems. And so even though it had killed my curiosity, I mean, eventually came back. Several years later, I definitely had a tolerance for difficulty. I think you had asked me, what was it? How do we create them? Or
how do we, foster curiosity being such a, and we'll move on maybe later in the conversation to kind of educational systems and whether they promote curiosity or not.
Yeah.
But in terms of, adults adapting curiosity, Flow Center, Csikszentmihalyi was a writer and author who's talked a lot about meaning and curiosity, and it sort of forms the fundamental components of what he calls an autotelic personality, of that kind of curious and challenge-minded individual. How in the past have you tried to implement leadership qualities or character traits, or just to embody curiosity?
I love it. And what I think I've discovered in my own work is, and it's a wonderful thing, is that they're all the character traits are just patterns that we have. And we've developed those patterns because we were, either rewarded or not rewarded for them. And you can be rewarded without an actual reward. You can be rewarded because something inspires you or doesn't inspire you, or creates positive emotion or doesn't create that. And so if we understand that aspect of humanity, emotions and how and why they're formed, and at the core of emotions is just how we interpret something. And so once you understand that all of our emotions come from how we interpret something, we interpret things because of beliefs we have. And as we present the truth, I think beliefs get changed. And so as beliefs get changed, our habits get changed, our patterns get changed, our character gets changed. And as our character gets changed, so does our life.
Yeah, indeed. And changing those habits, there's often a perception that that's so difficult to do. I am who I am, and whether that's genetic or whether that's my nurture, it's ingrained. And when we think of them as habits, patterns of thinking that have formed patterns of behavior, that have formed neural networks and electrical impulses that travel down the same pathways, when we look at all of that being moldable, being changeable, it really opens up new possibilities. And, talking about new possibilities, I really wanted to hear your take on your global inspirational goals. It was quite inspirational for myself when I first read it. And for those that don't know, the UN have a list of sustainable development goals in terms of where is action and energy being focused towards. And often they're towards, as the UN was initially created to stop World War III and to stop many of the problems that we face worldwide. And a little bit like the journey of psychology, which started off as a very much problem-focused discipline. The US military and government put a lot of money into helping soldiers who'd come back with issues, and how do we solve these problems. And in the last sort of 15, 20 years, more research, more psychologists have focused on, well, hang on, let's think about what we want to create. And in the process of aiming for what we want, perhaps a lot of these issues don't become so significant. And I know you've created the global inspirational goals and was able to present them to the UN. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
We had greatly influenced the UN to take on, the sustainable development goals. And I have to give them just such credit, because honestly, I think if I was trying to think of an organization in the world that was incredibly bureaucratic and political and things like that, I probably would say the UN is such an example. And yet they were able to disrupt themselves from the goal that they had for 70 years in a row to stop World War III in just 4 years. And so for me, the most inspirational part was obviously it was an extraordinary thing that now they're all about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But the fact that the UN could disrupt itself in just 4 years basically says that no organization in the world has an excuse for not being able to disrupt itself. And so it's just super inspiring to me. But I realized about, halfway through the first 15 years that the Sustainable Development Goals all focus on problems in the world, and they are probably the biggest problems in the world. I think they picked a really great set. I mean, I think they left one off, which I always think is the number 18, because 17 is such a weird number. I think they left off, governance and really coming up with modern governance for the world, because most of the governance systems in the world, or even the US, which is probably one of the newest ones, is still 200 years old. And the world was pretty different 200 years ago. But the idea was really came about when I started thinking about moonshots. And, a lot of companies and even governments in the world have been focusing on moonshots. What's your moonshot? And what's the biggest problem that you're going to solve? And how are you going to go after it? Like the way we went to the moon. But the truth is that we didn't go to the moon to just solve a world problem. I mean, there were some reasons we went to the moon, but it wasn't really to solve a problem. We went to the moon because it was incredibly inspirational. It was extraordinary. It was like the best of potential and even of humanity's potential. And I realized in the SDGs that they all solve problems. And I thought, well, what are we solving all the problems for? I mean, what if we solved all the problems? Then what would we do? And so we need more. There's more to life than just solving problems. And this is true even for our own lives. Like, we can't just focus on solving problems. There's things, we're bigger than that. And we're capable of doing extraordinary things, and not just us as individuals, but humanity. And so I wanted to create a set of inspirational goals that were at that same level. They were global inspirational goals, and they would be extraordinary things that humankind could do that wasn't just focused on solving a problem. So I presented that in July of last year during the 50th anniversary of landing on the moon. And we'll see. I imagine the UN's probably still focused on the SDGs, but I think it's in some people's thoughts now. And I hope that they take that on.
Do you believe that's a UN role, or one of, I guess, that lies on the doorstep of governance within domains or within countries?
So I often wondered even whether the SDGs should go to the UN. And, because I thought, I don't know if the UN would be able to convert itself and really focus on these. And yet they have, and they've done a truly extraordinary job. And they've done an extraordinary job in engaging countries to take these sustainable development goals and make them their own, and make their own subsets and things like that. And so, each of the 17 sustainable development goals could be solved within the 15 years from the date where they initiated it. I don't know. I mean, it's probably really unlikely now that that will happen, but you never know. I mean, things happen exponentially. And so even though, we're not halfway to progress on many of them, you never know if it's an exponential curve. And we really pick things up in those last few years before the deadlines. I think they could do a fantastic job on the global inspirational goals, because they're very connected. For example, one of the global inspirational goals is global free internet. I mean, the world would be a completely different place. You couldn't pinpoint necessarily a problem that solves, but it would solve a lot of problems, but it would be extraordinary. Or just how about global citizenship, where, I travel all the time, and I don't know that just because of the place I was born, that should be the place that I might affiliate with for the whole rest of my life. And so these ideas are ideas that represent the world now in the 21st century, where we know that we're on this, spaceship, and we have a much deeper understanding of where we are in the universe and the future, and, even other planets or other intelligences in the world. That's actually some part of some of those goals. So they're very exciting. And it would be awesome if the world started to focus on them together and fund them.
What would be? And this sort of systemic approach is, I can't help but think of the crossovers with education. And, I think I heard one of your talks yesterday, and you talked about only 2% of your education is actually used in your day-to-day. And it made me think about, how much we teach skills to solve problems or create jobs, as opposed to teaching individuals and developing individuals, developing that autonomy and that self-determination, that curiosity and courage we talked about, but more shoehorning individuals into boxes. And I find it fascinating how, countries such as Finland, have been able to produce exemplary educational systems where, by disrupting what most educational systems would think of as good education. They don't do much homework, where a lot of America's got rid of poetry from the curriculum. That's an integral part. And they've got rid of standardized testing and very much focused on that local integration with the community, as well as developing the human as an individual. And I'd love to, get your thoughts on what you see as an ideal education. What would that look like?
I think this is one of the most important questions for the entire planet. And I think that because there are some problems that when you solve those problems, many of the other problems just go away. I'm here in Greece and today, but, and Greece has many problems, just like all countries in the world do. But if they solve their economic one, then a lot of the other problems will just get solved, because then they'll have the money. And if you solve education, then a lot of the other problems, like how to get clean water, how to grow food, or how to move to somewhere that has food, like a lot of these other things go away. And unfortunately, it is my absolute belief that our education system, the entire world's education system right now, is completely obsolete. I say that because if you looked at the origins of our educational system, and I looked it up, and it really goes back, it's kind of crazy. It goes back to sort of British colonialism, where they had educational systems so that people could sort of read the contracts and do the math in order to pay the taxes. And that system is the same system that we have today. In the US, in fact, in most countries, the standardized test for K through 12, for kindergarten through 12th grade till you're 18, is basically two numbers, a math score and a verbal score. And then you have some grades too. But because of that math and verbal score, it will greatly determine whether you can get into Harvard or Stanford or MIT, or whether you can't even get into college. And this, I think, is crazy. And it's crazy because your math skills and even your reading skills, as important as they are too for learning, but they have very little to do with success in life. Another way to think about this is, well, what is a successful life? And to me, a successful life is really just like four things. Like I've thought about it a lot, and I realized, wow, it's so simple. It's just so simple. And if you just do sort of these four things, you'll have a successful life. And if you don't do one of these four things, you will not have a successful life. So health is one. And it's not, health doesn't give you a great life. What it does is it prevents you from having a bad one. And, our healthcare system today is not a healthcare system. It's a sick care system. We take care of people once they're sick. And the truth is that most of the sicknesses we get, if we were very healthy, we would never get them. Or if we looked at things like much sooner, we could solve them. And so basically, if you don't have your health, it's the only thing you end up focusing on. So we have to educate people to be healthy, not just educate. We got to train people to be healthy. Like many of us know what to eat, but we don't do it because we weren't trained that way. Second one, and we were talking about economy, right? Wealth. Like we got to teach people how to create wealth. But we have this very indirect route, and instead we sort of teach them how to get jobs. And then they're working their entire life in a salaried position, and after maybe 20 or 30 years, they've stored up enough where they can then, go off and do what they want, but they're 55 years old then. And it's just a crazy system. let's just teach people how to create wealth, and not just create it, but how to keep it. Because those are two totally different skills. I mean, I've lost all my wealth 3 times in my life. And though it took the 3rd time for me to realize, oh, keeping wealth is a different skill. Like it's just a different thing. And you got to learn that too. And even appreciating wealth. I have friends that have extraordinary wealth in even a physical sense and in other senses, but they don't appreciate it. And so what good is that? And then the 3rd thing is relationships. And in that, of course, is emotions, because emotions, you can't have great relationships till you figure out emotions. And with it is leadership, because the whole purpose, I think, of having great relationships, besides just, love and compassion and caring for each other, is the leadership, being able to bring together people to do even harder things that no one person can do. And then the 4th thing is happiness and fulfillment. Happiness I've learned, is pretty easy. I mean, you can buy a new car, you can be happy, but it just doesn't last. I mean, it often lasts until the first ding that you get on your car. You're not happy. And so, happiness is fleeting. And even if you learn, and I think this is a really important skill, is for people to learn just how to have a successful day. Most people have never learned even that. They go through their entire life and they've never learned how to even have one successful day. I mean, they've had some, but they never learned how to do it. And so they didn't know how to do it again and again. But even if you've learned that, you can get through your whole life having a successful day every single day, and you look back and you think it wasn't extraordinary. And so fulfillment is different. Fulfillment is about getting to the end of your life and looking back on it and going, wow, that was extraordinary. And so I think these 4 things, health, wealth, relationships, and fulfillment, are the only things. And we don't teach any of them in school, not one. So our educational system's broken. And if we were to teach those things to mastery, we'd have a completely different world. I have this thing now, and the idea was like, how do you get global exponential disruptive impact? And I realized the letters are GEDI. And so I came up with this idea of Jedi, which sounded like some other kind of Jedi, I think, that we're all familiar with. But I realized, what if we globally educated disruptors and innovators, which was also Jedi? And so now I've got this thing called Jedi Training, and it's just GEDI training.com. And what we're going to do is we've actually created a program where we train people to mastery how to do these 4 things. And the initial program is really expensive. I mean, it's a 2-year program, and it's a week or 2 every quarter, and it's $100,000. And so, but the idea is that we're going to figure out how to do that really well, and then keep figuring out a cheaper and cheaper way to deliver that until we can deliver it for, a few $100. That's the idea. And I'm super excited about it. And it's funny because I think I'm the only academic on the team. We got a team of like 25 people, and I'm the only academic. The others are, they're Navy SEALs or CIA officers or former ministers, or they're people that have developed character, right? And so they know how to do character, even though it was for their own specific purpose, whether it was military or religious. But the idea is, how do we train character traits in people so that they can master these 4 cornerstones?
Great idea. Love the name. And making it attainable to everyone is a real worthwhile aim.
And now a question to you. Do you need to raise your mental game? Are nerves, stress, or pressure getting in the way? We have found that spending a few minutes every day to build your confidence, focus, and mindset can make a massive difference to your life. We have helped thousands of professionals level up and start reveling in their challenges. It has been our privilege to support people in their endeavors, be a professional sounding board, and give people the skills to be their best. Getting a flow coach is invaluable, and for many, it has been life-changing. We are here for you too. If you want your very own flow coach to maximize your own performance and satisfaction in life, Simply go to flowcenter.org today.
Just to pick up on your last point there in terms of fulfillment, fulfillment, you mentioned it's that getting to the end of your life before you close your eyes for the last time and being able to close them with a smile on your face and a sense of purpose having been fulfilled. And I always go back to Aristotle's talks around finding and living with your diamond, finding your true nature and fulfilling that true nature and living with true purpose, and that creating a sense of fulfillment. And I also think it's, integrative into our daily rituals. And if we take that same analogy and close our eyes every time we go to bed at night, and do we have a sense of fulfillment in what we're doing? And certainly the process that we go over a lot at the Flow Center is a lot about creating meaning in what we do. And I'd love to hear, how in the Jedi training program you look to create that fulfillment.
Yeah, I really love the work actually that you're doing, and I agree with you. I think the challenge for yourself and myself are to think, how do we make this accessible, and how do we make it accessible, especially to the people that have been most disadvantaged simply because of where they were born and the environment they came in through the world shoe. So that it's an exciting future, and I hope we do get there. How do we go about getting these skills and things? So it's really interesting. I think I went through some sort of extreme government training, and if you go through training, say like Navy SEAL or CIA training or something like that, when you graduate, nobody wonders anymore whether you're capable of doing the job. In other words, you don't go through SEAL training or CIA training reading a whole bunch of books, and then someone at the end says, now go out and, capture some of these top 300 most dangerous people in the world. And so the difference in that education is that they brought those people to mastery. And until you have mastery, you're struggling. We talked a little in the beginning about, I just believe everything is hard until it's easy. But once it's easy, it's easy. And what you want is to make it so that life is easy. So that I spent most of my adult life struggling just to succeed at life. And, now that I've lived much of it, I realized, I could have just been taught that. Someone could have just told me that. In fact, some of the things, it would probably only take 1 minute for someone to say, like, hey, learning to keep your money is a different skill than learning to make money, or being an owner is a much better way to have money that doesn't make you tired, like being an operator, like being a CEO does. And so, I spent a lot of my time trying to be a CEO, and then being a CEO, and then realizing, well, that's not even the goal. The goal is to actually be the owner, to hire a CEO. And so, really simple things like that. And so I think in the Jedi program, what we do is we provide knowledge, but what we really want to do is develop these character skills. And the only way to develop character skills, unfortunately, is hard. And so we create experiences that mix really enjoyable, pleasurable, rewarding experiences with really hard, difficult, challenging experiences. And you have to do both, because if you just make the whole thing hard and challenging, everyone will quit and no one will want to finish. So you got to do both. But if you don't give, we make diamonds by rubbing them against rough surfaces, and character gets built kind of that same way. People learn powerful lessons for the rest of their life, unfortunately, through really challenging, difficult, even emotionally challenging experiences that sit in their brain for a long time and remind them why they do things and what's really important and what matters.
And what are those challenging situations you put people in? Can you give us an example of some of those?
Yeah. I mean, so when you go through the course, like the 2-year course, so we actually offer different ones. We offer a 2-year course, and then we offer a 4-day one, which is kind of like an overview of what happens in that 2-year one. So it's more really about the knowledge, and then you'd have to go off and kind of work on all those things yourself. And then we even have a 10-session one. So it's 10 90-minute sessions, and then it's done over, you get your choice, over 10 weeks, over 5 weeks, or over 2 weeks, depending on how intensely you want to do it. And so, in the 2-year program, for example, we have a whole week that's just dedicated to health. And really the only thing you get at the end of that week is that you will exercise and eat extremely well the whole rest of your life. And so you really get just like sort of 2 skills out of it. And then we have a whole week that's just about, it's kind of called asymmetric risk reduction, but it's just about how do you avoid really terrible things that would negatively affect the whole rest of your life. And so we teach people extreme driving, and we teach them how to actually be a very dangerous person so that they can get out of a deadly situation if they end up, how to give first aid to themselves or to someone else. So that week is about that. But, there are other weeks that are not about that at all. There's a whole week about relationships. There's a whole week about, in fact, there's 4 days that's just in total silence where we help people to just start beginning to listen to their inner voice. And one of the weeks, for example, is a week that involves some skiing. And the reason that we do skiing is not to sort of teach people to ski better, but we certainly do that. But we do it because it's one of the few things that I'm aware of where if we want to teach you courage, if we want to teach you something about fear, then we need to put you in a really fearful situation. And no matter how good a skier you are, we can find somewhere on the mountain that's going to scare you. And so we take you to that place. And that's when we can teach you about fear. And that's when you're super motivated to learn something about it. And in those moments, we can create that experience that's necessary. And those experiences end up being highly memorable. Mm-hmm. In fact, when you've done those experiences, the next time you're in a fearful situation, it's like click, you get flashed back to that moment just because of how the brain remembers things. And it remembers things by emotion. I mean, it has a factual memory, but when you can put things into the memory because of emotion, boom, you're drawn back immediately to that moment. And then that lesson is fully accessible for you. That's an example.
That's superb. In our coaching, we're often taking people rock climbing or free diving, and it would be the same aim to sort of shake the matrix, so to speak, and really help identify that inner voice and the relationship that we have with ourselves during those times. Because really, how we deal with stress is quite formulaic, and how we deal with stress in one thing is often very similar to how we deal with stress in every situation. And, typically, certainly in education, we're not taught how to deal with stress or how to deal with challenges and how to manage ourselves. And, I've got no doubt that much of this sort of void is a main reason for the crazy mental health statistics, where we have so many, over 25% of people being depressed in our lifetime and having a mental health related illness, and the anxiety that the kids grow up with nowadays. In Australia, there's anxiety issue in kids at 5 years old around schooling, and that's progressively going to become exponential in terms of how they deal with their lives, their relationships, and yes. They become decision makers and they create the future. And it's such it's so great to hear you doing that work, because it's such a fundamental pillar of how we can act in our lives and take that transferable learning. And even if it's, how we operate in a confronting conversation with our partner, it's amazing transferable knowledge.
I think you really kind of nailed it on the head too, around this, this idea behind the beliefs and the voice. I would actually think, in the biggest sense, I believe it's about the identity that a person has, that if you can transform the identity, then everything gets changed with it. And so, one of the parts, for example, in the program that we do is there's a week where in a single week, they learn how to fly a plane. And normally that takes quite a long time, but it turns out, people really are capable of learning how to fly a plane in a week. And so we do that not to teach them to fly the plane. In fact, they can get their full license just in 2 weeks, but we do it because when you've learned to fly a plane in a week, your identity is transformed. Because, flying a plane is physical and it's intellectual and it's emotional. And so it actually captures on all three of these elements. And when you've done that, you can't think about yourself the same anymore. When you come across another challenge, there's this part of your brain that says, well, I'm that gal or I'm that guy that learned to fly a plane in a week. And so I'm sure I can do this too. And confidence obviously has an extreme impact on, what challenges people are willing to either take on or stick with. And so we can change that in just identity. And so as you talk about these young kids that are depressed, even when they're 5 years old and things, and it kills me because I know that the skill set for us to transform them is there. It just hasn't become widespread yet in the world. But we're all going to be able to read and write when we're 18. So we at least got that going for us.
We hope so. We hope so.
Every day I use a certain product that I consider essential in helping me to be my best. My life is very demanding, and this product has been a game changer in optimizing how I live and perform. Want to know more? Well, this space could be the perfect opportunity for me to share a detailed testimonial on your product, making my viewers feel that they are getting an inside tip to how I live an optimal life, and giving them an opportunity to purchase your product or service. We only have a limited space to work with a few companies. So if you want your product or service on this podcast, get in contact now.
How, if you were to make one change within education at the moment to disrupt it and to innovate it in the manner in which we've been talking, what change do you think is ideal, even if not so practical?
Unquestionably, the change would be we teach character. Because if we teach character, all this stuff becomes easy. And as you teach character, identity changes with it. In fact, it can't not be changed. If you take someone that is normally not, and then you make them and help them to become curious, compassionate, courageous, they're not the same person anymore. Because, a person is just the set of patterns that they have. And if you give them these I think of them as superpowers. You give them these new superpowers, they're not the same person because they don't have the same patterns anymore. And so if you take someone that is timid and not learning and afraid and getting beat up or something, and you give them courage, their life is transformed now. And as their life transforms, so their identity transforms with it. And now, because they have a different identity, their potential as a human being in their mind is no longer the same. In fact, my very strong belief is that most people, the lives that they live, have been constrained by their own beliefs about what they're capable of. And so most people, I think, live extremely simple, meager lives relative to what their potential is, but they don't believe it. Most people don't even leave the town that they were born in, not because anyone stops them. They just never think, well, maybe I should try living somewhere else because it might actually be better than here, or I might learn something. They never even get to that point because they create their own walls. And the truth is that we are exponential beings. I spent the last 10 years talking about exponential technology, but the truth is that technology is exponential only because human beings make it so, because we are the exponential thing. We're the exponential being. The technology and the exponential technology is just an effect of what we are.
And I guess an expression of that exponential action, if you like, one might consider being flow in that optimal state of functioning. And so much of that is limited by us. You know, we get in our own way all the time, and
right.
Reaching a state of optimal performance is often kind of paraded as this sort of elitist, incredible, you know, you've got to reach the peaks of mastery and it's only reserved for the amazing people out there. And, you know, and really, I guess the message we try to get across is that let's reverse that. You know, our optimal state of functioning is a very natural state, you know, one that we all have, we can all tap into. And it's often a case of sort of learning to get out of our own way as opposed to bolting on superhuman skills.
It's not even that people have to live extraordinary lives. Like you can have an extraordinary life, you know, because of a single moment, one single moment in your life. You know, we see that all the time. I know, you know, people ask me and they say, how do I become an extraordinary leader? And they look at, you know, examples of extraordinary leaders. And if any of us looked at these examples, I mean, I look at, you know, Mandela or Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I mean, I look at these people and I just think, you know, we'd be hard pressed, any of us, to have the set of character traits that they had to the level that they had them. But the truth is that all of them, in fact, even, you know, I think a lot with Martin Luther King, all of his works were inspired by really just one woman, you know, and it was one woman, Rosa Parks, and she inspired almost all of his works because of where she chose to sit in a single day in her life on a bus. And when you realize the exponential capacity of even a moment in our life to change the world, then you realize that it's within the reach of any of us.
And that change can happen quickly. You know, that butterfly effect can be far reaching very quickly.
It is always the butterfly effect. Yeah. All big things come from something tiny.
We're running a little bit out of time, and I really want to touch on some of your personal experience as well in terms of, you know, what have you found you've had, by many eyes, a remarkable life, and you're highly motivated and working on some really exciting projects. And I know you've, in the past, you were an All-American NCAA athlete and you spent time doing martial arts. And I know a lot of the lessons that can get learned then, and really intrigued as to what you feel has really helped you on your journey to live the life and have the mindset and application that you do.
Well, I will give gratitude to, you know, the people in my life that had such great influence on me. And when I say great, I don't even mean it in the sense that at the moment it was great. You know, I think when we can take the hardest moments in our life, the most painful moments in our life, and reinterpret those and understand those as the most magnificent moments in our life, that's when I think we are gaining the greatest benefit from experience. And so, you know, for me, it's not that I look and I think of these fantastic mentors or educators, and, you know, I'm very grateful to all of them. But it was the really hard personal moments that happened, and the things that I didn't know were coming, that I didn't expect, that were painful or hurtful. It was in those moments that I learned the most. And my belief is that if we can do that with our life, not only do we change the worst moments in our life to the absolute best moments of our life, but as we go forward, we embrace everything that the world is going to offer us, things that we put judgments on as good or bad, or, you know, fabulous or the opposite of that. Like, we embrace everything. And And we really start to not just live in the moment, because I don't think it's just about being in the moment. I really think that one of our superpowers is this ability to come forward with the past and to think about the future and to bring them all, into the present in that moment. If I can take sort of 30, 60 seconds and just tell this very brief story, because I heard it in Japan. I think we got connected actually by an individual that lived in Japan. And it was a story about this sort of, I don't know, it was sort of like a Last Samurai story or something to that effect. And this samurai is being chased by a bear. And as he's being chased, he looks ahead into the future and he sees that there's a cliff ahead of him. And he has no choice but to end up jumping off of the cliff because of the bear. And then he's falling and he hits this branch halfway down the cliff. And now he's on this branch. And he looks down and there's a tiger underneath him jumping, which is his new future, leaping up, trying to grab him. And then the bear is above him growling and he's sitting on this branch and it's a strawberry branch and there's a big strawberry right in front of him. And he reaches out and he grabs the strawberry and he puts it in his mouth and says, delicious. I just didn't understand that story for the longest time in my life. And now I get it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. And what one book, has had the biggest impact on your life?
I think Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He tells the story, really. I mean, he was incarcerated in a Nazi prison camp and everything taken from him, everyone being killed and dying around him. And yet he was able to find sort of an essence of humanity that survives and surpasses everything. And I think it's an extraordinary book with an extraordinary story of a person who had to experience something that none of us would ever want to go through. Very powerful.
Great stuff. Well, David Roberts, thank you very much for your time. And if you want to find more information about David Roberts, I'm sure he's all over the internet.
I would probably direct them to the JEDI, the GEDI training.com. I think there, it's not fully built out, but over the next year, I think we will slowly build that out more and more to be able to help people to, acquire skills. And I think that is a really wonderful place for people to go. I really thank you, Cameron, too, for the time. It's fascinating, and I appreciate you bringing up topics that I know are just important to me, and I believe they're really important to the world and to individuals. So thank you for the work that you do and for these podcasts you do.
Absolutely. And I think, a key takeaway is developing character, in all that we do. And we may not all work in education, but whether we like it or not, we're all educators and we can all build character in all that we do and how we lead. So thank you very much for the talk.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Flow Unleashed.
In the fitting words of Martin Luther, the prosperity of a country depends not on the abundance of its revenues, nor on the strength of its fortifications, nor on the beauty of its public buildings, but it consists in the number of its cultivated citizens, in its men of education, enlightenment, and character. Here are to be found its true interest, its chief strength, its real power. There are two things we have to do alone in life: dying and living through character. We all have somewhat of a responsibility to strive towards betterment, to further our gene pool and leave the world in a better place than we found it. Whilst this may seem like a daunting task, it couldn't be more in our control. By simply choosing to be our best self in the moment before us, right now, we breathe life into the words of Martin Luther. And in the collection of many of these moments, we take enormous strides to make the world a better place. If you would like to find out more about David Roberts, please see the show notes. Thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe to get notified when our next episode drops. The more people that subscribe, the better I can make the show for you. Equally, please leave a review. Your review will go a long way to helping others find this pod. Until the next time, thank you for listening to Flow Unleashed.